I'm John Sloboda, music psychologist, in conversation with Peter Fender, composer. Peter, hello. We had a conversation about a month ago, so it's nice to connect with you again.
Morning, John. Yes, it very much is. I enjoyed chatting to you.
Well, we're in a slightly different place now in that you've finished the composition, or at least you've got something down on paper for every movement.
I have. I've basically got everything. So, in a sense, it's finished. There are a few, I's to dot and T's to cross, but essentially it's done.
So that gives us a great opportunity to actually reflect on some kind of bigger issues about the entire process. I'm very interested in the question of judgment. What's going on in your head, Peter, when you make decisions and judgments?
I think as a composer in 2023, I'm really aware that there are all sorts of possibilities in terms of the style of music you compose. So if I were to compose something, say, in the style of Palestrina or Mozart, I'm sure that would be acceptable. If it were in the style of just about anybody one can think of, there's a sort of an acceptability to that. So in that sense, I'm acutely aware that there is an enormous range of possibilities out there. One of the things that's been really interesting about this conversation and this process has been reflecting back on myself and seeing, well, why do I want to write the music I want to write? As a sort of first thought. So I've become more and more aware that I do write music within the tonal language, within a sort of diatonic language. It's stretching it a bit from when it was, at its height, let's say with Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. But I'm certainly within that language. So for me, when I'm composing, I have a sense of a home, a key that is the home to the music and that I'm returning to. I have an awareness, a sense of feeling, an emotional awareness, perhaps is the best way to put it, of what a chord is, what the chord I've just written means emotionally. Some chords have a lighter feeling, some a darker feeling, etc. Things of that type. What an interval means. That only can occur for me within a tonal system. If I was working in, say, a serial system, it would have a completely different feel. So, a major seventh within a serial system doesn't at all feel like a major seventh within a tonal system. The judgment I'm using when I'm going along and thinking, yeah, this sounds right, or this doesn't sound right. So I did a video where I was talking about being uncertain of what interval to give a flute at a very specific moment in the first movement. And I initially gave it the interval of a minor sixth because I was thinking a lot about the interval of a minor sixth. And that seemed to be quite important. But when I gave it that interval, it didn't sound right. So I was thinking, well, why on earth does that not sound right? And I worked out that in the context of what I was doing, the minor sixth gave a very hollow feel. I can only use that term, as a sort of an emotional response to it. But I think that's an emotional response within the tonal system. And I've heard lots and lots of minor sixths in the past. And I know the sort of feel they have and the sort of, if you like, the emotional meaning they have. And I had to make it a major sixth in the end, which within that system, again, it gives a slightly brighter feel. The minor sixth just felt slightly empty. And in some circumstances, that would be absolutely fine and right, I suspect. But at that moment, I needed the slight brightness. Could I even use the word optimism that a major sixth gives to me? And I actually tried several different intervals, ranging from a perfect fifth up to a major seventh. And the major seventh really had this sort of slightly painful, yearning feel. So that was the thought process there. I sort of pinned down to, well, that's because of the system within which you're running amok, your field within which you're playing, Peter.
But it's interesting that the initial feeling was just, oh, that sounds wrong. And it was kind of later that you worked out to your own satisfaction why it was wrong. But what's interesting is that therefore you must have in your brain automatic knowledge of all these things, which instantaneously rings a bell, which either says yes or no.
Yes or no? Yes.
And then painstakingly, by the application of your knowledge and your music theory, background, and so on, you then afterwards work out, oh, that's why it was wrong. Have I
Yes.
got that right?
I think absolutely right. Yes. So I have imbibed all of that great music. I suppose my brain has a home, has a place where it feels most comfortable. And that's, I guess, what guides that initial reaction.
So I would imagine that your judgment is so sure and secure because over your lifetime you've listened to loads and loads of music of a tonal genre. You've written a lot of it. So in a sense, it's become almost automated. And this is very similar in a way to how we learn our native language. By and large, we tend to be able to speak our language correctly. And when someone makes a grammatical error or chooses the wrong word, we immediately think, oh, no, that's not right.
Mm-hmm.
But then if someone asked me, well, why is that not right? As foreign language English speakers very often ask me, well, why do you say that word and not that word? I
Yeah.
have to say, well, let me think about that. I'm actually not quite sure
Yeah.
because my knowledge of grammar is not explicit. It's implicit in the usage of the language. And I wonder whether for skilled musicians such as yourself, a lot of your knowledge is implicit in that way.
That's a lovely analogy. I hadn't thought of that at all. One thing that has occurred to me while I've been thinking about this, the word weird comes up in my mind every now and again. It's almost as if I've got a sort of a weirdness quotient for the music I'm writing. Occasionally, as a specific example, I might write a bit and then think, oh no, that sounds far too weird, or doesn't sound weird enough. So there's some sort of, I don't know, some sort of norm, I suppose, in my mind, from which occasionally I'm thinking I'm deviating to make it sound a little bit stranger, a little bit weirder. And I'm actually genuinely conscious of that from time to time. So I'll play something on the piano and think, okay, that's a chord. It's not right. Why is it not right? Well, it just sounds too normal, and I want it to sound a little weirder. So I'll spice it up with a ninth or a 11th or something strange in there to give it a little bit of bite, perhaps. But then the opposite can occur as well. I'll write something and think, oh my goodness, that really sounds far too weird, and I end up having to simplify it. I think that happens more. The latter happens more than the former.
I want to pick up something that we touched on in our last conversation, which you call weirdness, and I suppose I would call originality. And we were talking about judgment, and you were saying quite rightly that you would judge something as right or wrong in the sense that it fits within the language or the idiom that you're trying to portray in a particular composition. But it also could be that if what you write fits too well and too cozily, that there's nothing very kind of surprising or original. And composers surely want to surprise and want to be original. So perhaps elaborate a bit.
I see exactly what you're getting at. Do you know, the first thing that occurs to me as you say that is to do with security. It's to do with my own personal feeling of security, in the sense that if I write something that to me seems rather dull, then I will expect other people will feel the same. The performers and audience will go away saying, oh, well, that was jolly pleasant. Thank you very much. Shake my hand, and as they walk out the door without terribly much meaning behind it. That sort of makes me feel rather insecure. I think we all crave security. In this process, that's one of the things I think I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that makes me feel secure within the context of a composition which is going to be performed. So people are going to actually look at these dots, make sounds, and other people will hear them. So it's a security within that context that I think I'm after. Reflecting back on myself, I have a certain way of acting in public. certain way that people see me as a conductor, as a performer, as a composer. And I suppose what I'm doing in making judgments about what I think is good or bad, right, wrong, weird, not, is I'm trying to back up what I want that persona to look like. And that is clear, comprehensible, but actually has a little bit of an edge to it and isn't necessarily what people would have thought was going to be said or was going to be heard.
I think that very often the job of a musician, whether it's a composer or a conductor or a performer, is to hold a listener's hand and say, here you are, here's something happening that you will be able to understand. But from time to time, I'm going to surprise you, which is actually what keeps a listener engaged with your story. But if all the time it's, oh, I never expected that, oh, and I don't expect that, and I didn't expect that, you've got no signposts or structure on which to expect anything.
So, yes, I think that's exactly right. I personally, as a listener, I need something to hold on to. If I've got nothing to hold on to, then the amount of information going to my brain just overwhelms it. I can't sort it out. So I do like to try and give some of that when I'm writing music. I'll give you a specific example from this symphony, which maybe fits in to what you were saying. The beginning of the last movement starts quite quietly with some sort of gentle string chords, and some of the wind playing almost little fanfare type motifs above that. But it's fairly gentle. But then suddenly the timpani breaks in and there's a very loud couple of chords, and it immediately moves into a much more sort of angst section. I then decided that I wanted to prefigure that, to have a sort of a pre-echo, if you like, of that. So in the third movement, in a section which was completely different, quite repetitive section, where it felt that nothing much was happening for a little while, I then brought that very loud timpani crashing sort of thing in just for 2 seconds, and then it's gone. And it's back to just the sort of slightly meandering, repetitive stuff. And I don't know if I thought about it specifically like that, but it definitely was. I definitely wanted an interruption. Everybody's got used to this little thing for the last couple of minutes, and then, oh, where did that come from?
So it seems that you do have a fairly clear plan in your mind and a desire to do something of a certain sort at a certain place, which informs your judgment. Have you ever got to a complete roadblock?
Yes, several times. Several times during the writing of the symphony, I've had that feeling. I think when you haven't written anything, there can be a block at that point, just getting something out. But when you do start to get something out, at least for me, I feel, oh, it's sort of started to come now. Oh, yes, we're in the easy bit. It's just going to all come out. It's a silly thought. I don't know why I think that, because I know that's not going to be the case. And when in the midst of that, you reach a block, that's very frustrating, because you've just had this thought, oh, it's going to just sort of trickle out now, and it stops. There are two things that can help me there. One is, I suppose the obvious one is just to stop, literally stop, walk away. And that type of complete brain break can definitely help. Something the subconscious clicks in at some point, sometimes, not always. Another thing that can help is thinking big. So if I've got a block, I've got to a section and I'm writing a section, then there's this huge amount of doubt suddenly creeps over me, and I think, well, Peter, is this actually any good? You've just spent 2 hours writing this bit, but I'm not sure I like it that much. And I'm shush, shush, shush. I've spent 2 hours on this. You can't tell me you don't like it now. Come on, listen. There is that conversation. And sometimes what helps rather at that moment is thinking structurally. So thinking, where am I in the symphony? Okay, I'm in the middle of the second movement. I've had this section to open it, and this, and I'm on the third section of that movement. Yeah, actually, this isn't the appropriate music for this point. I need something that's a little more something else than what you're doing here. What you've done might be fine in another context. So with the program I use, what you can do is, if you've written a section and then you think, no good, you can actually save that bit in the program, take it out of your composition, but you've not lost it completely. And I quite like that, the feeling that I haven't just literally rubbed the thing out, so it's gone forever. But anyway, that structural thing does sometimes help, because I often think about the structure, about the order of sections. I quite often find myself bookending. So, in fact, with the symphony, the beginning and the end of the symphony have the same music. The structure matters a lot.
You've embarked on a very unusual process, which not many composers have done, of diarying your progress over these months, talking about it to camera and talking about it with others such as myself. That's really a quite different process, maybe, to the kind of process that you've engaged in when you composed previous pieces. So yep. I want to ask you the question, how has doing this journaling impacted on you as a person, and maybe impacted on your sense of yourself as a composer, and how you actually composed this symphony?
In part, I take you back to what we talked about 2 chats ago, where I mentioned the word weirdness. I think I have become quite a lot more aware of my thoughts that we discussed then about what constitutes normality, weirdness, strangeness in music, and how I respond to those things and how I want my music to sound in relation to those things. So there's an awareness that has grown during this process of that, without a doubt. 2 other things I can think of specifically immediately. One is, I suppose I would say, the need for parameters. I think, again, it's a growing awareness. I don't think if somebody had asked me 2 or 3 years ago, before all this was happening, this documenting of the process of writing the symphony, if somebody had asked me then about parameters in music, I think I would have said something similar, but I wasn't aware of it in the same way as I am now. For me, at any rate, I need clear parameters. So the awareness that I am writing, I think to a fairly large extent, perhaps not 100%, but writing to a large extent within a tonal framework, just being clear about that. So again, that's an awareness of where I am, where I'm coming from, which it's a very nice thing, actually. A third thing, which is not always so nice, is again an awareness of the inner struggles that I have in working out what sounds good. So the judgment that we were talking about before, that is not always something that comes easily. The struggles are me saying to myself, I mean, sometimes literally, as I said then, how weird is this? How ordinary is this? How does this make it sound as if I'm just somebody who has missed out most of the 20th century and not noticed what has happened? How much of this is going to be picked up by somebody who is very keen on tonally based music and saying, oh, well, Peter, that's a little bit strange. Why did you have to inject that oddness? To some extent, those are external voices, but they're not for me. They're in there. They're in the mix of my own speaking to myself.
So that's a very interesting point. I mean, you could have done this journaling process entirely as a private process. You know, you have made notes yourself and reflected on them over time. But you decided to journal in this very public way of making videos, which will now sit on YouTube forever. How does the public element of this figure in why you decided to do this?
I think part of the reason for that is quite a simple decision that if I said, right, I'm going to document this process publicly, it was more likely to happen. Fitting in that sort of diarying and reflection process with just myself as the audience, I'm not sure I'd have got very far, to be frank. So in the same way that one of the first things I did was, right, Peter, you're writing a symphony, concert. When's the concert going to be? Book a venue, book a date, and then it's going to happen. So I'm not gonna sort of go halfway through something and then go, no, it's not happening. I can't do it. So there was a very practical element in that sense. I'm not sure I would have found it very easy anyway if it was if it was a private process. And I'm now thinking about that. I'm actually glad that it is a public one, because what it's doing is enabling me to reflect in a way I don't think I would have been able to do. In conversations with people like yourself, people asking questions, moments where I'm thinking, how can I explain this to somebody who's not a composer, who's not a musician, who doesn't have that sort of knowledge? So there's all sorts of stuff going on here, which has enlarged firstly, my awareness, and hopefully my ability to connect with different types of people.
That's fascinating. And do you think that as a result of having done this on one composition, that the way you compose in the future will somehow be affected by it or changed in some way?
I think at least subtly, yes. Yeah, I am now more aware, because I've been making myself think about it, of the process that I'm going through, or that I have been going through, of what has worked, what has been a bit of a dead end, why I've gone down dead ends, how I've got away from them, how I've created the things which seem to me to be the best that I'm capable of doing. So yeah, I think that whole awareness will carry forward.
Well, there's an understanding among scientists that you can't observe something without changing it, because your very observation of it impacts on it. And yes, I'm sure that must be true in some way for this particular process, that you will be changed as a result of it in ways perhaps you can't predict, but they will certainly impact on what you do in the future.
Yeah, I found it a really interesting little journey. I don't know what I expected when I started. I think I expected it to be a little more matter of fact, a little bit more me saying, here's a minor chord, here's a major chord. I'm choosing the major one because it sounds happy. Well, perhaps not quite as banal as that, but more sort of click, click, click. But the thing that has slightly surprised me, and I think is my takeaway, is that it's really all about self-reflection. It's all about, for me, it's all about me understanding what's going on and why it's going on. And those decisions, like we talked about before, about judgment, about when it sounds better, when it doesn't sound better. And I do find that all really, really fascinating.
As I do indeed. And it's been a great pleasure to be able to talk to you, Peter. Thank you very much.
A pleasure. Thank you, John.